Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Folio. Thank you for joining us as we open a new case file, delving into the unsettling intersections of psychology and criminal action. How can one individual command such absolute devotion that their words override another's conscience? In this episode, we explore the terrifying power of a master manipulator, the cult leader. We will dissect the methods used to forge unwavering loyalty and investigate the chilling case, where a leader's orders culminated in irreversible tragedy, proving the most dangerous weapon is often a persuasive voice. Case 1. The Manson Family, the Helter-Skelter Murders. Our journey into the mechanics of manipulation begins not in a sterile laboratory or a lecture hall, but under the relentless sun of the California desert. The year is 1967. A cultural revolution is in full bloom, a tide of idealism and disillusionment that washes over the nation's youth. They are searching for truth, for meaning, for an alternative to the establishment they feel has failed them. And in this fertile ground of spiritual hunger, a predator was waiting. His name was Charles Millis Manson. To understand the monster, one must first understand the man. Manson was not born a leader. He was forged into one by the institutions he despised. His childhood was a chaotic mosaic of neglect and petty crime, culminating in a life spent cycling through juvenile halls and federal prisons. But prison for Manson was not merely a cage. It was a university. He devoured books on esoteric philosophies and fringe religions. He studied the techniques of Scientology, learning how one could audit and deconstruct a person's psyche. Most critically, he immersed himself in Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, internalizing its lessons not as tools for self-improvement, but as a blueprint for control. When he was released on parole in March of 1967, at the age of 32, Manson stepped into the vibrant, chaotic world of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district. He was a man out of time, a product of the rigid 1950s prison system dropped into the heart of the summer of love. He was short, unkempt, with mesmerizing, intense eyes and a magnetic, if unsettling, charisma. He carried a guitar he couldn't expertly play and spoke in rambling, circular parables that seemed profound to those adrift on a sea of psychedelic drugs and existential confusion. He did not seek followers, he collected them. The first was Mary Brunner, a university librarian who let him move into her apartment. Soon, others gravitated towards his orbit. They were overwhelmingly young, middle-class, and searching. Girls like Lynette Squeaky from Patricia Katie Krenwinkel and Susan Sadie Atkins, all fleeing what they perceived as suffocating suburban lives. They saw in Manson not a con man, but a guru, a Christ-like figure who offered them unconditional love and freedom from society's rules. This was the first stage of his manipulation, love bombing. He showered them with attention, made them feel seen and special, and created an intoxicating sense of belonging. The group, which he began to call the family, soon left the city behind. They wandered, living a nomadic existence in a converted school bus, eventually settling at the remote and dilapidated Spahn Ranch, a former movie set in the hills of Los Angeles County. This was the second, crucial stage of manipulation: isolation. Cut off from their families, friends, and the outside world, their only source of information and validation was Manson himself. At Spahn Ranch, he systematically dismantled their identities. He controlled every aspect of their lives: what they ate, when they slept, and who they had relations with. He renamed them, severing the last ties to their former selves. His primary tool of indoctrination was a combination of psychedelic drugs and repetition. Nightly, the family would gather around a campfire. Manson would dose them with LSD and then begin his rap's long, rambling sermons that blended scripture, Scientology, Beatles lyrics, and his own paranoid philosophies. Under the influence of the acid, his followers' minds were open, their defenses down. His words, repeated night after night, became their reality. He taught them that they were not the children of their biological parents, but children of the All, and he was their father, their guide. He preached the dissolution of the ego, convincing them that their individual thoughts and feelings were illusions. Only the group's will, which was, in reality, his will method. He was conditioning them, slowly and methodically, to cede all control. He was emptying their minds to fill them with his own. The final piece of the ideological puzzle arrived in the form of a record album. In late 1968, the Beatles released their self-titled double LP, which came to be known as the White Album. To the world, it was a masterpiece of rock and roll. To Charles Manson, it was a prophecy, a coded message sent directly to him by the four angels from Liverpool. He would listen to it for hours on end, dissecting the lyrics, finding hidden meanings that confirmed his own burgeoning apocalyptic vision. He called this vision Helter Skelter, after the album's raucous track. In Manson's twisted interpretation, the song was not about a carnival slide, but about the coming chaos. He preached that a cataclysmic race war was imminent. The black population, he claimed, would rise up and slaughter the white pigs who oppressed them. But, being intellectually inferior in his racist view, they would be unable to govern themselves after their victory. They would need a leader. This is where the Manson family came in. According to his prophecy, while the cities burned, the family would retreat to a mythical, bottomless pit in Death Valley. There, they would wait out the war, multiplying until they numbered 144,000, a figure taken from the Book of Revelation. When the chaos subsided, they would emerge from the desert to rule over the black population, who would willingly serve their new white masters. Manson and the family would be the saviors and inheritors of the earth. There was only one problem. The race war wasn't starting. Manson grew impatient. He preached to the family that the black man was stupid and needed to be shown how to begin the revolution. The family, he decided, would have to kickstart Helter Skelter themselves. They would commit a series of gruesome, shocking murders, framing black revolutionaries for the crimes. The murders had to be brutal, sensational, and explicitly pinned on black perpetrators to ignite the white population's fear and spark the war. The indoctrination was now complete. The followers, stripped of their identities, isolated from reality, and programmed with a divine mission, were no longer individuals with their own moral compasses. They were extensions of Manson's will, instruments for his apocalyptic fantasy. The violence began to escalate. In July 1969, Manson sent 3 members, including Bobby Beausoleil, to the home of a musician and acquaintance named Gary Hinman, demanding money. When Hinman refused, they held him hostage for 2 days. Manson himself arrived, and in a fit of rage, sliced Hinman's ear with a sword. He then left, ordering Beausoleil to finish the job. Beausoleil stabbed Hinman to death. On the wall, as instructed, he scrawled "Political Piggy" and drew a panther paw print in Hinman's blood-clear attempt to frame the Black Panther Party. Just over a week later, on August 8, 1969, Manson gathered his chosen disciples at Spawn Ranch. He looked at Charles Tex Watson, one of his most loyal male followers, and gave the order. "Go with the girls," he said, "and go to the place where Terry Melcher used to live. Totally destroy everyone in that house, as gruesome as you can." Terry Melcher was a record producer who had once shown interest in Manson's music, but ultimately rejected him. The house, located at 1050 Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon, was a symbol of the establishment that had scorned him. Manson was not just starting a race war. He was exacting personal revenge. Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian was chosen to be the driver because she had a valid license filed into an old Ford. Kasabian knew the general mission, but not the horrific specifics. The others were primed. They were not going to commit a crime. They were fulfilling a sacred duty. The house on Cielo Drive was now occupied by the actress Sharon Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant, and her husband, the film director Roman Polanski, who was away in Europe. That night, she was entertaining friends: Jay Sebring, a celebrated celebrity hairstylist, Abigail Folger, the heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, and Folger's boyfriend, Wojciech Frykowski, a friend of Polanski's. Watson climbed a telephone pole and cut the phone lines to the house. The four slipped onto the property. The first person they encountered was an 18-year-old boy named Stephen Parent, who was driving away from the guest house where he had been visiting the property's caretaker. Watson met him in the driveway, lunged at him with a knife, and then shot him 4 times, killing him instantly. The mission had begun. Kasabian was ordered to stand guard at the gate, a post from which she would hear, but not see, the unfolding nightmare. Watson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel entered the main house. They found Frykowski sleeping on the living room couch. Watson kicked him in the head, and as Frykowski groggily asked who he was, Watson replied with chilling simplicity, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." They rounded up the other occupants: Tate, Sebring, and Folger, and herded them into the living room. Panic and terror filled the air. Jay Sebring pleaded for them to consider Tate's pregnancy. For his concern, Watson shot him, then stabbed him 7 times. The scene devolved into chaos. Frykowski, whose hands had been bound with a towel, managed to break free. He fought desperately for his life, struggling with Atkins, who stabbed at his legs. He staggered out of the house onto the front lawn, but Watson pursued him, striking him over the head with the butt of his pistol so many times the grip broke, before stabbing him a total of 51 times. Inside, Abigail Folger also broke free from Krenwinkel and ran out another door, screaming for help. Krenwinkel chased her across the lawn, tackling her and stabbing her repeatedly. Watson joined in. She was stabbed 28 times. Back in the house, Sharon Tate was left, pleading for the life of her unborn child. She begged them to take her hostage, to let her live just long enough to have her baby. Her pleas were ignored. Susan Atkins and Watson fell upon her. She was stabbed 16 times. As a final, grotesque act, Atkins took a towel and dipped it in Tate's blood. On the front door of the house, she wrote a single word: pig. When it was over, the killers calmly walked away, leaving behind a scene of almost unimaginable carnage. Linda Kasabian, who had witnessed parts of the horror from her post, was in a state of shock. They drove away, discarding their bloody clothes and weapons in the hills along the route. Back at Spawn Ranch, they were greeted by Manson. He asked them if they felt any remorse. They said they did not. The indoctrination had been a success. Their humanity had been erased. But Manson was not satisfied. The murders, while gruesome, had not been reported in the media with the panic and racial overtones he had hoped for. The following night, he decided he had to go along himself, to show them how it's done. On the night of August 9th, he drove with Watson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, Kasabian, and 2 others, Leslie Van Houten and Steve Clem, Grogan, searching for their next victims. After hours of driving, Manson selected a house at 3301 Waverly Drive in the Los Feliz area of Los Angeles. It was the home of Leno LaBianca, a supermarket executive, and his wife, Rosemary, a boutique owner. Manson and Watson entered the house alone first. They woke the sleeping couple at gunpoint and assured them they would not be hurt, that it was only a robbery. After binding them, Manson went back to the car. He sent Krenwinkel and Van Houten inside with a new set of orders: kill the couple. Then he, Kasabian, and the others drove away, leaving the three to carry out the sentence. Watson took Leno LaBianca to the living room, while the two women took Rosemary to the bedroom. The violence was just as savage, but more ritualistic. Watson stabbed Leno repeatedly with a bayonet. When he was finished, he carved the word war into the man's abdomen. In the bedroom, the women struggled with Rosemary, eventually stabbing her 41 times. After the couple was dead, Krenwinkel used their blood to write on the walls. Death to pigs and rise were scrawled in the living room. On the refrigerator door, a misspelling that would become infamous: Helter Skelter. For weeks, the city of Los Angeles was gripped by terror. The two sets of murders were so brutal, so seemingly random, that they defied logic. The police were baffled. The Cielo Drive case was investigated by one team, the LaBianca case by another. For a time, no one connected them. The motive seemed to be either a drug deal gone wrong or a ritualistic killing, but nothing added up. The idea that a single group was responsible for both seemed too fantastic. The break in the case came not from brilliant detective work, but from the arrogance of the killers themselves. In October 1969, Manson and most of the family were arrested at their new desert hideout on suspicion of auto theft, an unrelated charge. While in custody, Susan Atkins began bragging to her cellmates about her involvement in the Tate murders. She described the events in chilling detail, believing she was untouchable. Her cellmate, Virginia Graham, horrified by the confession, went to the authorities. Suddenly, the pieces began to click into place. Investigators linked Atkins's story to the evidence from both crime scenes. The panther paw print from the Hinman murder was connected to the writings at the LaBianca house. The web of clues finally led back to one man, Charles Manson. Linda Kasabian, terrified and racked with guilt, had fled the family shortly after the murders. She turned herself in and, in exchange for immunity, became the prosecution's star witness. Her testimony would provide the narrative thread that tied Manson directly to the murders. Though he had not physically killed anyone at either location, his orders were the catalyst, his philosophy the weapon. The trial, which began in June 1970, was a media circus. It was a spectacle that put the family's bizarre dynamic on full public display. Manson, ever the showman, played to the cameras, disrupting proceedings with outbursts and strange behavior. At one point, he lunged at the judge with a pencil. One day, he appeared in court with a bloody X carved into his forehead. The next day, the female defendants on trial with him, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, appeared with the same mark, a sign of their undying loyalty. They were no longer just defendants. They were martyrs for Manson's cause, giggling and singing songs as testimony described their horrific acts. The prosecution, led by Vincent Bugliosi, meticulously laid out the helter-skelter motive. It was a theory that many found hard to believe. Could a rock and roll album truly be the inspiration for such butchery? But Kasabian's testimony, combined with the corroborating evidence, painted a clear and terrifying picture of a cult leader who had absolute control over his followers' minds. He had convinced them that murder was not a sin, but a necessary act to bring about a new world order. In January 1971, the jury found Manson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten guilty of murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Tex Watson was tried and convicted separately later. All were sentenced to death. However, their sentences were commuted to life in prison in 1972 when the California Supreme Court temporarily abolished the death penalty. The story of the Manson family is more than a tale of murder. It is a case study in the terrifying potential of human manipulation. It demonstrates how a charismatic individual can exploit psychological vulnerabilities, the need for love, for purpose, for belong to methodically strip away a person's autonomy. Manson did not use physical force to make his followers kill. He used ideas. He built an alternate reality, a closed system of logic where his word was gospel and murder was a righteous act. His followers were not born evil, they were programmed to be. They were living proof that under the right or rather, the wrong circumstances, the human mind can be convinced to do anything, to cross any line, in service of a leader's orders. The tragedy he authored was not just the loss of innocent lives, but the complete and utter annihilation of his followers' own will. Case 2. People's Temple, the Jonestown Massacre. If Charles Manson was the dark reflection of the counterculture, a predator who thrived on chaos, our next subject was a monster who wore the mask of order. He did not emerge from the desert fringes of society. He rose from its most sacred institution, the church. He built his empire not on psychedelic prophecy, but on the promise of social justice, racial equality, and a communal utopia. His name was James Warren Jones, and he offered his followers heaven on earth. He would ultimately deliver them to a hell of his own making. Jim Jones was a product of the rural Midwest, born in Indiana in 1931. From a young age, he was an outsider, a precocious and strange boy obsessed with religion and death. He would hold elaborate funerals for small animals and preach to neighborhood children in his family's barn. While other boys played games, Jones was studying the Bible but also the works of Stalin, Marx, and Hitler. He was not absorbing their ideologies so much as their methods, fascinated by how men could command the unwavering belief of the masses. He saw in religion not a path to salvation, but a vehicle for power. In the 1950s, Jones founded his own church in Indianapolis. He called it the Wings of Deliverance, later renaming it the People's Temple Full Gospel Church. From its very inception, the temple was radical for its time. In a deeply segregated America, Jones preached a message of absolute racial equality. He actively welcomed African American congregants, placing them in positions of leadership and providing social services that the state would not. His church ran soup kitchens, provided housing assistance, and became a true community hub. He and his wife, Marceline, were the first white couple in Indiana to adopt a black child, creating a rainbow family of adopted children from various ethnic backgrounds. To the outside world, and to his growing flock, Jim Jones was a visionary, a compassionate leader putting his Christian ideals into action. This was the foundation of his power, a genuinely noble cause. He attracted idealistic individuals, both black and white, who were tired of the hypocrisy and injustice they saw in the world. They saw in Jones a man who wasn't just talking about a better world, but actively building it. They gave him their trust, and soon he would ask for more. The first subtle shift in his methods of control involved creating a powerful us versus them narrative. Jones preached that the outside world was corrupt, racist, and on the brink of a nuclear apocalypse, which he alone had foreseen. In 1965, citing an article that named the area as one of the safest in a nuclear event, he moved the entire congregation, about 140 of his most devoted followers, to Redwood Valley in Northern California. This was a critical step. Much like Manson moving his family to Spahn Ranch, Jones was isolating his flock, cutting them off from their support networks, and making them entirely dependent on the temple for their social and spiritual lives. In California, the People's Temple flourished. Its membership swelled into the thousands. Jones's methods of recruitment and control became more sophisticated. He established communal living arrangements, persuading members to sell their homes and turn over their life savings and monthly paychecks to the church. In return, the temple provided for all their needs. This financial consolidation gave him absolute power over their lives. To leave the temple was to become destitute. He solidified his divine status through staged, miracle healings. He would claim to cure cancer, pulling what he said were cancerous tumors, actually bloody chicken gizzards, from people's throats. His aides would rifle through the trash of new members to learn about their personal lives and medical histories, which Jones would then reveal during sermons, presenting it as divine, psychic knowledge. For believers, these were powerful confirmations of his power. For those with doubts, the social pressure to conform was immense. His psychological control was even more insidious. He instituted catharsis sessions, which were public forums for confession and punishment. Members were encouraged and often forced to confess their deepest fears, insecurities, and transgressions in front of the entire congregation. These confessions were then used against them. Family members were turned against one another, children encouraged to inform on their parents. Any sign of dissent, a questioning glance, a desire to see outside family was labeled a sign of bourgeois thinking or disloyalty to the cause. The punishment could range from public humiliation and beatings to being forced to fight other members in a boxing ring. He was systematically breaking down their individual identities and family bonds, reforging them into a single organism with himself as the brain. By the mid-1970s, Jones had moved the temple's center of power to San Francisco. He was no longer just a preacher, he was a political kingmaker. His disciplined and dedicated followers represented a powerful, get-out-the-vote army. Politicians, including Mayor George Moscone and Harvey Milk, courted his support. Jones was appointed to the city's Housing Authority Commission. He had achieved a level of legitimacy that made him seem untouchable. Behind the scenes, however, his paranoia, drug abuse, and tyranny were escalating. Stories of physical and sexual abuse, and of members being held against their will, began to leak out. The media started to investigate. Faced with growing scrutiny, Jones initiated his final, most audacious plan. For years, he had spoken of a promised land, a socialist paradise where the temple could live in peace, free from the racism and capitalism of the United States. He had found his location, a remote tract of jungle in the small South American nation of Guyana. He called it the People's Temple Agricultural Project. The world would come to know it as Jonestown. The exodus began in 1977. Over 900 people, a third of them children, followed their prophet into the jungle. They went with hope, believing they were pioneers building a new world. What they found was a prison camp disguised as a utopia. The reality of Jonestown was grueling agricultural labor for 11 hours a day, 6 days a week, in the tropical heat, on a diet of rice and beans. Their passports and medications were confiscated upon arrival. They were completely cut off from the outside world. All mail, incoming and outgoing, was censored. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. And everywhere, always, was the voice of Jim Jones, broadcast from a central public address system, his sermons and ramblings echoing through the settlement day and night, even as they tried to sleep. The paranoia that had been simmering in California boiled over in the isolation of the jungle. Jones convinced his followers that they were surrounded by enemies. The CIA, mercenaries, and racist forces in America, he claimed, were plotting to destroy their paradise. He began to conduct white nights, loyalty tests that were, in fact, rehearsals for mass suicide. Alarms would sound in the middle of the night, and everyone would be forced to assemble at the central pavilion. There, Jones would speak of the imminent attack by outside forces. He would tell them that the only honorable way out was revolutionary suicide, a protest against a fascist, racist world. He would instruct them to line up and drink from a vat of liquid that he told them was poisoned. They would do it. They would watch their friends and family drink. And then, after an agonizing wait, Jones would announce that it was merely a test of their loyalty, that the poison was not real. He conducted these drills dozens of times. He was conditioning them, desensitizing them to the act, making the unthinkable a routine part of their existence. Back in the United States, a group called the Concerned Relatives was growing. Composed of ex-members and family of those in Jonestown, they lobbied the government, providing affidavits detailing the human rights abuses within the temple. Their pleas eventually reached Leo Ryan, a Democratic congressman from California known for his hands-on investigative style. In November 1978, Ryan announced he would lead a fact-finding mission to Jonestown, accompanied by journalists and members of the Concerned Relatives. Jones initially resisted, but ultimately agreed to the visit, planning to stage a carefully orchestrated performance. When Ryan's delegation arrived on November 17th, they were greeted with a celebration. The settlement was clean, the people seemed happy, singing and dancing for their guests. Jones, though visibly gaunt and unwell, was a gracious host. For a full day, the illusion held. The journalists were impressed, and Ryan was prepared to give a largely positive report. But the facade was fragile. During the festivities, a reporter and a cameraman were secretly passed notes by temple members. The notes were desperate pleas. Please help us get out of Jonestown. The next day, Ryan announced to Jones that a number of residents wished to leave with him. For Jones, this was the ultimate betrayal. His control had been breached. His followers were choosing the capitalist pigs over him. It was a public humiliation he could not endure. His paranoia exploded. As the defectors and Ryan's delegation prepared to leave on the afternoon of November 18th, the plan for their destruction was set in motion. A temple member who had pretended to be a defector staged an attack on Ryan with a knife inside the settlement. Ryan was unharmed, but it was a sign of the chaos to come. The group hurried to the nearby Port Kaituma airstrip, where two small planes were waiting. As they were boarding, a tractor-trailer filled with Jones's elite armed guards, his Red Brigade, arrived. Without a word, they opened fire on the group. The attack was swift and brutal. They methodically shot and killed Congressman Leo Ryan, 3 journalists, NBC reporter Don Harris, NBC cameraman Bob Brown, and San Francisco Examiner photographer Greg Robinson, and one of the defectors, Patricia Parks. 10 others were wounded. It was a calculated act of murder, an assassination of a U.S. congressman on foreign soil. Jones had crossed the point of no return. He knew what was coming next, the full force of the U.S. government. The end had begun. Back in Jonestown, the sirens sounded for the last white night. Jones's voice, now strained and frantic, came over the loudspeakers, summoning everyone to the pavilion. "We have to go," he said. "The congressman has been murdered." He told them that the outside world would now descend upon them, that their children would be taken away and tortured, that their enemies would show them no mercy. He twisted the airstrip massacre into an act of aggression against the temple, not by it. He presented their revolutionary suicide not as an escape, but as their final, defiant act. A large vat of grape-flavored flavor aid was brought out, laced with a cocktail of cyanide, Valium, and other tranquilizers. The final order was given. The recording of this final hour, the infamous death tape, is a document of almost unbearable horror. On it, you can hear the cries of children. The plan was to poison the babies and children first. Nurses filled syringes with a purple liquid and squirted it into their mouths. Parents, weeping, held their children as they went into convulsions and died. There was some resistance. A woman named Christine Miller can be heard on the tape, bravely arguing with Jones. "I think we all have a right to say what we think," she says, questioning the necessity of death. "I don't think this is what we want to do." Jones dismisses her. "I don't care what you think," he snaps. The crowd shouts her down. "We are not committing suicide," Jones insists, his voice rising. "It's a revolutionary act." Some drank willingly, believing it was their only option. Others were forced. Armed guards surrounded the pavilion, ensuring no one could escape. They watched as families huddled together, parents poisoning their own children and then themselves, lying down to die side by side. It was a production line of death, efficient and absolute. In total, 909 people died in the pavilion and surrounding grounds of Jonestown. An additional 5, including Jones's loyalist Sharon Amos and her 3 children, died by his order at the temple's headquarters in Georgetown. When Guyanese soldiers arrived the next day, they found a scene of eerie, silent devastation. Bodies lay in neat rows, arm in arm, a carpet of death covering the ground. The sheer scale of it was incomprehensible. Jim Jones was found dead in a deck chair overlooking the scene, a single gunshot wound to his head, likely self-inflicted or administered by an aide. He had orchestrated the final performance, then taken his own, separate exit. The Jonestown Massacre remains a profound and disturbing chapter in the study of cults. It was not simply a mass suicide. It was a mass murder orchestrated by a paranoid narcissist who could not bear to lose control. The victims were not fanatics, they were idealists. They were people who had joined a movement they believed would build a better world, only to be led into a jungle, stripped of their autonomy, and convinced that death was preferable to life. Jim Jones exploited their noblest intentions, their desire for community, for justice, for faith, and twisted them into instruments of his own madness. He promised them a paradise, and, when his control was threatened, he chose to burn it, and everyone in it, to the ground, a final, terrible testament to a leader whose love was conditional and whose orders were absolute. Case 3. Aum Shinrikyo, the Tokyo Sarin Attack. Our path of inquiry now leads us away from the desperate communes of the American West and the sweltering jungles of South America. We travel to a society that, on its surface, seemed immune to the chaotic allure of cultism, Japan in the late 1980s. This was a nation at the peak of its economic power, a culture defined by discipline, conformity, and technological achievement. It was a world of serene temples and gleaming skyscrapers, a society that valued the collective over the individual. It seemed an infertile ground for the kind of radical, personality-driven movement we have just examined. But beneath this placid surface of order and prosperity, a spiritual void was growing. For a generation of Japan's best and brightest, the pressure to succeed was immense, yet the rewards felt hollow. They were cogs in a vast, efficient machine, their lives mapped out from elite university to corporate drone. They yearned for a deeper meaning, a higher purpose that neither their ancient traditions nor their modern consumerism could provide. And into this vacuum stepped a new kind of prophet. He was not a charismatic drifter or a righteous preacher. He was a bizarre fusion of yogic mystic, doomsday seer, and mad scientist. His birth name was Chizuo Matsumoto. The world would come to know him as Shoko Asahara. Asahara's early life was a crucible of resentment. Born in 1955 with congenital glaucoma, he was partially blind and educated at a boarding school for the visually impaired. He was intelligent and domineering, but his poor eyesight barred him from the prestigious universities he longed to attend. He failed his entrance exams, a deep source of humiliation in Japan's meritocratic society. After dabbling in acupuncture and traditional medicine, he found his true calling in the world of fringe spirituality. He traveled to India, studied yoga and meditation, and claimed to have achieved the ultimate state of enlightenment. In 1984, he founded a small yoga and publishing circle called Aum Shinsen no Kai, which would later evolve into Aum Shinrikyo, or Aum Supreme Truth. Initially, his teachings were a syncretic blend of early Buddhism, Hinduism, and apocalyptic Christian prophecy. He promised his followers spiritual liberation and the development of supernatural powers, levitation, clairvoyance, telepathy. He produced faked photographs of himself seemingly floating in a lotus position, evidence of his mastery. His methods of recruitment were a stark departure from those of Manson or Jones. He did not prey on the lost and marginalized. Instead, he targeted the intellectual elite. He set up recruitment booths at Japan's top universities, attracting brilliant, disillusioned students of science, medicine, and engineering. To these young people, trapped in a rigid, materialistic society, Asahara offered something intoxicating, a secret, higher knowledge. He told them their scientific pursuits were meaningless without a spiritual foundation, and that only through him could they unlock the true potential of their minds and save the world. He gave them a purpose that felt grander than a corporate career. The indoctrination process was systematic and pseudoscientific, designed to appeal to his highly educated followers. He established communes on remote properties, most notably a large compound at the foot of Mount Fuji in a village called Kamakushiki. Here, like the cults before, he enforced isolation. Contact with families was forbidden, as they represented the tainted, outside world. Life within the commune was a grueling regimen of extreme asceticism, long hours of meditation, and forced labor, all designed to break the individual will. Asahara's methods, however, incorporated a uniquely technological and terrifying element. He developed a device he called a perfect salvation initiation, or Christ initiation headset. This was a cap fitted with electrodes that followers were forced to wear for hours or days on end. It delivered low-voltage electrical shocks to the brain while playing endless loops of Asahara's chanting and recorded sermons. He claimed it synchronized the wearer's brainwaves with his own, but its true purpose was sensory deprivation and psychological bombardment, a form of high-tech brainwashing. He also made extensive use of drugs, including LSD and sodium thiopental, which he called a truth serum, to break down resistance during interrogations. He structured Aum Shinrikyo not as a church, but as a parallel government, a shadow state with himself as the holy pope and enlightened master. His most loyal and intelligent followers were appointed to ministries: a Ministry of Health, a Ministry of Finance, and most chillingly, a Ministry of Science and Technology. This structure gave his educated followers a sense of importance and order, appealing to the very mindset they had been trained in. They were not just cultists, they were pioneers building a new, enlightened civilization. Asahara's theology grew darker and more paranoid. He began to preach of a coming Armageddon, a final, cataclysmic war between Japan and the United States, which he claimed was the great beast of Revelation. He prophesied that this war, which he would call World War III, would be fought with nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. He prophesied that this war, which he would call World War III, would be fought with nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. And in this scorched, post-apocalyptic landscape, only the spiritually pure his followers in Aum Shinrikyo would survive. They would then emerge to rebuild civilization in their own image. It was a fantasy of ultimate power, born from a lifetime of perceived slights and failures. A critical turning point came in 1990. Believing in his own messianic destiny, Asahara and 24 of his top disciples ran for seats in the Japanese Diet, the national parliament. They campaigned bizarrely, wearing masks of Asahara's face and singing his praises. The result was a categorical and humiliating failure. Not a single Aum candidate was elected. For Asahara, this was definitive proof that the democratic system was corrupt and that the masses were too ignorant to save themselves. If he could not win power through legitimate means, he would seize it through terror. The path to Armageddon was now clear. The cult's activities turned definitively criminal. The first and most telling act of this new phase was the murder of the Sakamoto family. Tsutsumi Sakamoto was a young, tenacious lawyer who was building a class-action lawsuit against Aum on behalf of families whose relatives had been absorbed by the cult. He represented a direct threat to Asahara's control and secrecy. In November 1989, a team of Aum's elite members, acting on Asahara's orders, broke into the Sakamoto family's apartment in Yokohama. They murdered Tsutsumi, his wife Satoko, and their 1-year-old son, Tatsuhiko. They injected them with potassium chloride and then carefully buried their bodies in separate, remote locations across Japan. The family simply vanished. The police were baffled, and for years, their disappearance remained a mystery. Within Aum, the message was clear. Any opposition, internal or external, would be met with total annihilation. The line had been crossed from a spiritual movement into a murderous conspiracy. With his internal power consolidated by fear, Asahara turned the formidable intellect of his followers toward a single goal: building an arsenal to wage war on the state. The Ministry of Science and Technology, led by his most trusted scientific mind, Hideo Murai, began a program of weapons development that would rival that of a small nation. They attempted to culture botulinum toxin and anthrax spores, at one point spraying a crude botulinum solution from a building in Tokyo in a failed attempt at biological warfare. They even sent a mission to Zaire under the guise of providing medical aid, hoping to obtain a live sample of the Ebola virus. But their most significant and terrifying success was in the field of chemical warfare. They focused their efforts on sarin, a nerve agent so deadly that a single drop on the skin can be fatal. It is odorless and colorless, an invisible killer developed by Nazi scientists in the 1930s. In the heart of their Kamakushiki compound, Aum constructed a massive, sealed chemical plant codenamed Sat-Yen 7. Inside this building, Aum's team of chemists and engineers, men with doctorates from Japan's best universities, worked tirelessly to mass-produce the poison. After several deadly accidents and failures, they succeeded. By 1994, Aum Shinrikyo possessed a significant stockpile of military-grade nerve gas, a weapon of mass destruction in the hands of a doomsday cult. Their first deployment of this weapon was not an act of random terror, but a calculated legal tactic. In June of 1994, Aum was embroiled in a real estate lawsuit in the city of Matsumoto. A court was expected to rule against the cult. To prevent this, Asahara ordered a preemptive strike. The targets were the 3 judges presiding over the case. On the night of June 27th, an Aum team drove a converted refrigerator truck into the quiet residential neighborhood where the judges lived. Inside the truck was a simple, yet effective, device, a heater and a fan designed to vaporize and disperse liquid sarin. They parked the truck and let the invisible cloud of death drift through the summer night air. The attack was not precise. The judges survived, though they were seriously ill. But the indiscriminate poison killed 8 innocent people in their homes and injured more than 500 others. It was a horrific mass poisoning. Yet, Aum's involvement remained a secret. In a catastrophic failure of investigation, police and the media focused their suspicion on the first man to report the incident, Yoshiyuki Kono. Traces of chemicals used for pesticides were found in his garden, and for nearly a year, he was publicly vilified as the prime suspect. This incompetence provided Aum with a valuable lesson. They could strike with a chemical weapon and remain undetected. It emboldened them, confirming Asahara's belief in the foolishness of the outside world. By early 1995, police pressure on Aum was mounting from multiple angles. Authorities were closing in, investigating the cult for kidnapping and other crimes. A massive, coordinated raid on all of Aum's facilities was scheduled for March 22nd. Through his network of informants, Asahara learned of the impending raid. He was cornered. His response was to lash out, to unleash chaos on a scale never before seen, to trigger his long-prophesied Armageddon. He ordered the Ministry of Science and Technology to prepare for a major attack on the Tokyo subway system. The goal is to disrupt the government, cripple the city, and throw the police into such disarray that their planned raid would be impossible. On the morning of Monday, March 20th, 1995, the plan was put into motion. It was a model of cold, calculated precision. 5 senior Aum members were designated as the attackers. These were not crazed foot soldiers. They were the cult's elite. Ikuo Hayashi was a 48-year-old heart surgeon from a prestigious hospital. Kenichi Hirose was a 30-year-old physicist. Toru Toyota was a 27-year-old with an honors degree in applied physics. Masato Yokoyama was a 31-year-old polymer engineer. Yasuo Hayashi was a 47-year-old electrical engineer. Each man was given 2 or 3 small plastic bags filled with liquid sarin. Each bag was carefully wrapped in newspaper. They were assigned to 5 separate trains on 3 of Tokyo's busiest subway lines, the Marunouchi, Chiyoda, and Hibiya lines. These lines were specifically chosen because they all converged or passed through Kasumigaseki Station, the nerve center of the Japanese government, home to most of its ministries and the National Police Agency headquarters. The attack was timed for the peak of morning rush hour to ensure maximum casualties. Each attacker boarded his designated train, carrying the deadly packages and a sharpened umbrella. As the trains approached key central stations, they dropped the newspaper-wrapped bags on the floor and, with a swift, discreet jab of the umbrella tip, punctured the plastic. They then exited the train at the next stop, leaving the leaking poison behind. The effect was not immediate. Sarin is volatile, and as the liquid began to evaporate in the crowded, enclosed train cars, the invisible gas began to spread. The first signs were coughing and stinging eyes. Then, vision began to dim as pupils constricted to pinpoints. Breathing became difficult. People began to stumble, drool, and convulse. Panic erupted. At each subsequent stop, stricken passengers staggered out onto the platforms, collapsing and spreading the contamination. The subway, a symbol of Japanese efficiency and order, transformed into a series of subterranean gas chambers. First responders and station employees rushed to help, completely unaware of the nature of the threat. They carried victims, tried to perform resuscitation, and in doing so, became victims themselves. The city's emergency services were overwhelmed. No one knew what was happening. Initial reports spoke of an explosion, but there was no blast damage. It was an invisible, silent assault that left chaos in its wake. In the end, 13 people died, and over 6,200 were injured, many suffering permanent neurological damage and chronic health problems. The attack sent a wave of terror through a nation that prided itself on public safety. The image of a modern, first-world metropolis being brought to its knees by such a crude yet sophisticated attack was a global shock. The police, who had already been preparing to move on Aum, now had their smoking gun. The raids on March 22nd went ahead with overwhelming force. What they found inside the Aum compounds confirmed their worst fears. It was a doomsday prepper's fortress, a terror state in miniature. They discovered laboratories with enough precursor chemicals to produce sarin capable of killing millions of people. They found stockpiles of illegal drugs, an armory of automatic weapons, and even a Russian military helicopter. They found malnourished followers held in solitary confinement in shipping containers. And on May 16th, after a 2-month manhunt, they found the mastermind. Shoko Asahara was discovered hiding in a small, secret space concealed between the walls of a building at the Kamikwashiki compound. The guru, who claimed supernatural powers, was found meditating alone in the dark. The subsequent trials were among the longest and most complex in Japanese legal history. They laid bare the inner workings of the cult, a horrifying world of absolute obedience, scientific perversion, and messianic madness. One by one, the perpetrators and leaders were convicted. Ikuo Hayashi, the doctor, expressed remorse and cooperated with prosecutors, receiving a life sentence. The others, including the brilliant scientists and the core leadership, along with Shoko Asahara himself, were sentenced to death. In July of 2018, nearly a quarter of a century after the attack, Asahara and 12 of his key disciples were executed, finally closing the legal chapter on Aum Shinrikyo. The legacy of Aum is a uniquely modern horror story. It serves as a terrifying reminder that indoctrination is not limited to the uneducated or the disenfranchised. It shows that the brightest minds, filled with the most advanced knowledge, can have their reason and morality completely subverted by a singular, powerful will. Asahara did not offer his followers freedom from society. He offered them a sense of intellectual and spiritual superiority to it. He weaponized their ambition and their search for meaning. Aum Shinrikyo demonstrates the chilling synthesis of ancient apocalyptic belief and modern technological capability, a cult that did not just withdraw from the world, but actively sought to destroy it, proving that the orders of a master manipulator can turn a nation's greatest minds into its most terrifying monsters. Case 4. Heaven's Gate, the final exit. Our investigation has thus far traced a path of violence. From Manson's bloody quest to start a race war, to Jones's paranoid massacre in the jungle, to Aum's apocalyptic terror in the heart of a metropolis, the orders of the leader have always culminated in the destruction of others. But our final case presents a chilling inversion of this pattern. Here, the ultimate order was not to kill for the leader, but to die with him. The mission was not to destroy the world, but to quietly, meticulously, and willingly leave it behind. We now enter the sterile, orderly, and deeply strange world of Heaven's Gate. The story begins, as many do, with two people who believed they were destined for something more. Marshall Applewhite was a former music professor from Texas, a gifted vocalist whose personal life was unraveling due to internal conflicts over his sexuality. Bonnie Nettles was a nurse from Houston with a deep and abiding interest in theosophy, astrology, and biblical prophecy. They met in 1972 in a hospital where Nettles worked and Applewhite was visiting a friend. The connection was immediate and profound. Applewhite felt he had known her his entire life. Nettles, in turn, told him that their meeting had been foretold to her by extraterrestrials. Together, they concluded that they were not mere humans. They were the two witnesses described in the Book of Revelation, divine messengers sent to Earth in human bodies, which they referred to as vehicles or containers. Their mission was to gather a crew of like-minded individuals and teach them how to graduate from the human condition to a literal, physical kingdom of God in outer space, which they called the next level. They were not figures of faith to be worshipped, but teachers in a cosmic classroom, and they referred to themselves as Do and T after the musical notes. In the mid-1970s, Do and T began traveling across America, holding meetings in living rooms and community halls. They called their message Human Individual Metamorphosis. They attracted a small but devoted following of spiritual seekers, people who felt alienated from mainstream society and drawn to the promise of a tangible, sci-fi salvation. The initial recruits were instructed to sell their possessions, cut off all contact with their families and friends, and join them in a nomadic existence. This was the first, essential step of control, total isolation, and the severing of all earthly ties. To enter the classroom, one had to leave everything else behind. The group's internal culture was one of extreme discipline and identity annihilation, far more systematic than Manson's chaotic family. Individuality was an obstacle to be overcome. Members shed their human names and were given androgynous, two-syllable new ones. They adopted a uniform of baggy, unisex clothing and short, severe haircuts to erase all signs of gender and sexuality. Human emotions, desires, and relationships were mammalian, behaviors that had to be suppressed. The goal was to become a clean slate, a perfect, genderless vessel ready for a higher consciousness. The central pillar of their doctrine was celibacy. Applewhite, who had struggled with his own homosexual urges, taught that sexual feelings were the primary anchor keeping a soul tied to its human vehicle. To truly be free, one had to conquer the flesh completely. To prove his own commitment and set the ultimate example, Applewhite and several other male members traveled to Mexico and underwent surgical castration. It was the ultimate physical expression of their ideology, a literal cutting away of their humanity to prepare for their alien future. The theology of the group evolved over time. As the 1970s UFO craze gave way to the 1980s, their biblical language was increasingly replaced with the vocabulary of science fiction. God was an advanced extraterrestrial. Jesus was a next-level representative who had arrived in a spaceship 2,000 years ago to teach an earlier class. The resurrection was not a spiritual miracle, but a physical event where he was beamed aboard the mothership. Do and T were simply the latest instructors, here to prepare the final class for graduation. A profound crisis struck the group in 1985 when Bonnie T. Nettles died of cancer. For any other cult, the death of a supposedly immortal leader would be a catastrophic failure. But Applewhite, now the sole commander, masterfully reframed the event. He taught the group that T had not died. She had simply shed her deteriorating vehicle and returned to the next level, proving that their process worked. She was now their guide in the heavens, preparing the way for them. Her death became a validation of their entire belief system, and it solidified Applewhite's absolute authority as the only remaining representative on Earth. For the next decade, the group, which now called itself Heaven's Gate, lived a quiet, insular life. They supported themselves by forming a successful web design company they called Higher Source. In a strange marriage of ancient asceticism and modern technology, they embraced the nascent internet, using it as a tool for both income and recruitment. They were not hiding from the world in a remote compound like in Jonestown or Comiquishiki. They were living within it, yet completely separate from it, anonymous web designers by day, future star travelers by night. The final catalyst, the sign they had been waiting for, appeared in the sky in 1995. It was the discovery of Comet Hale-Bopp. As the comet grew brighter and became a global spectacle, Applewhite saw it not as an astronomical event, but as the fulfillment of a prophecy. He became convinced that a massive spacecraft, a ship from the next level, was traveling in the comet's wake, hidden by its bright tail. This was their ride. The window of opportunity to leave Earth was finally opening. The time for graduation was at hand. In late 1996, the preparations for the exit began. Their actions were not those of desperate, frantic people, but of meticulous planners preparing for a long journey. They rented a sprawling 9,200-square-foot mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, an affluent suburb of San Diego. They systematically began to close down their business and settle their affairs. And most chillingly, they began to record what they called their exit statements. One by one, the 38 members of the class, plus Applewhite himself, sat in front of a video camera. They appear calm, articulate, and in many cases, visibly happy, almost giddy. They speak with the quiet confidence of people about to embark on the greatest adventure of their lives. A man named Thomas Nichols, a brother of the actress Nichelle Nichols who played Uhura in Star Trek, smiles and says, "I'm the happiest person in the world." They speak of their love for Dew, their excitement to see tea again, and their relief at finally shedding their human containers. These tapes are perhaps the most disturbing artifacts of the Heaven's Gate story, a testament to the totality of their indoctrination. They did not believe they were dying. They believed they were going home. The plan for the exit was as orderly as everything else in their lives. The suicides were to be carried out in 3 waves, allowing members of the later waves to assist the earlier ones and clean up after them. The method was a lethal cocktail of the sedative phenobarbital mixed into applesauce or pudding, washed down with vodka to enhance its effect. To ensure death, they would then place plastic bags over their heads. The process began on or around March 24, 1997, as the Hale-Bopp comet reached its closest and brightest point to Earth. The first group of 15 members took the mixture. After they had passed, the second group carefully cleaned the scene. They repositioned the bodies on their beds, covered them with identical, diamond-shaped purple shrouds, and placed them in a state of serene repose. Then the second group of 15 took their turn. And again, the remaining Membersa group of 7, including Applewhite, cleaned up after them. Finally, the last group, including their leader, took the poison and left the world behind. Their final uniforms were deliberate. Each of the 39 members was dressed in an identical black shirt and black sweatpants. On their feet were brand new, black and white Nike Decade sneakers. In their pockets, each carried a $5 bill and 3/4 interplanetary toll money, perhaps and a form of identification. They had packed small bags, as if for a trip. Everything was neat. Everything was planned. Everything was final. The world learned of their departure on March 26th. An ex-member, Rio D'Angelo, who had left the group years earlier but remained in contact, received a package in the mail. It contained 2 videotapes with the exit statements and a letter. It read, "By the time you receive this, we'll be gone." D'Angelo, understanding the horrifying meaning, contacted the police. A San Diego sheriff's deputy was dispatched to the Rancho Santa Fe mansion. He found nothing amiss from the outside. Peeking through a window, he saw a pristine, quiet house. But upon entering, he was confronted with a scene of profound and silent strangeness. It was not a scene of chaos or violence, but of an eerie, ritualistic peace. 39 bodies, 21 women and 18 men, lay in their bunk beds and on mattresses, perfectly arranged, covered in their purple shrouds. The air was still. The house was immaculate. It was a scene so bizarre and orderly that it defied immediate comprehension. It was not a crime scene in the conventional sense. It was the quiet, successful culmination of a 25-year spiritual journey. The Heaven's Gate mass suicide stands apart in the dark catalogue of cult tragedies. It was not an act born of rage or fear of an outside enemy. It was the final, logical step in a belief system that taught its adherents to despise their own humanity. Marshall Applewhite's manipulation was subtle, paternal, and absolute. He did not need to shout or threaten. He simply needed to build a new reality, brick by logical brick, until the fantastical seemed rational and self-destruction seemed like the ultimate act of self-improvement. The tragedy of Heaven's Gate is not just that 39 people died, but that they did so with such calm and hopeful conviction, having been taught that the only path to heaven was to follow their leader's final, fatal order out of the world. We have now closed 4 case files, each a unique map of manipulation, each a testament to the terrifying power of a leader's orders. We saw how a promise of freedom could lead to murderous chaos, how a quest for utopia could end in a jungle of death, how intellectual pride could fuel apocalyptic terror, and how a yearning for transcendence could be twisted into a calm, orderly exit from life itself. The methods were different, but the core mechanism was the same: the complete and willing surrender of the self to a singular, dominant will. These stories remind us of the profound fragility of the human mind and the enduring search for meaning that can, in the wrong hands, lead us down the darkest of paths. May you find peace in your own truths and question those who claim to hold them for you. Good night.